Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Happy Thursday. We're very pleased that you can be with us today to talk about ZeroGrid. We're going to get started in just a minute. I'm just going to give everyone a moment to join and get connected to audio, and then we'll get started in just a moment. All right, it looks like we still have some people joining, but we have a lot to get through today. So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. I'm Erin Callahan, RMI's Corporate Engagement Director. We hope you've joined us to hear about ZeroGrid. That is the topic of today's conversation. It's RMI's newest initiative that we're working with a small group of corporates on. We are incredibly excited about it. So we're very excited to be talking with you all today and answering any questions that you have, sharing some of our plans, and talking through what we hope to accomplish over the next year. We will be recording this session and sharing out the slides. So if you wanted colleagues to join who couldn't, we will be sharing those with you after the session. We also invite your questions. We will have time for Q&A toward the end of the session. So you'll see a Q&A box at the bottom hand of the Zoom. I'm sure you've used that many other times in many other calls. Feel free to drop any questions throughout the session in that, and we'll try and make sure that they're answered. Just to quickly run through the agenda on the next slide, we're going to give a brief introduction of ZeroGrid and what it is, what we're planning to do, what our plans are. And then we'll jump into a panel discussion with two companies. We're thrilled to have Salesforce and General Motors joining us today for this conversation. And then we'll close with how to get involved in ZeroGrid if you're interested over the next year. And as I mentioned, we will have time for Q&A throughout the session. I want to go ahead and hand off to Steve Abbott, a principal in RMI's US program, who's one of our leaders on the ZeroGrid work, to walk through what ZeroGrid is. So Steve, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you.
Great, thank you, Erin. And good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I want to start by just acknowledging the impressive impact that corporate voluntary action has had in decarbonizing the US electric grid over the last 10 years. Many of you may be already familiar with this chart produced by CEBA, or the Clean Energy Buyers Association, which shows the impressive track record that companies have had in bringing new wind and solar assets online over the last 10 years, and the steady growth in that activity. And much of this is due to the great work of our colleagues over at CEBA. However, I also want to acknowledge that there is a lot more work to be done. What I'm showing here on this chart is based on data from Bloomberg New Energy Finance's New Energy Outlook. And even with the impressive tailwinds provided by the Inflation Reduction Act, there is still a significant gap between what the US is likely to do if all actors are acting in their own economic interests. That's the top teal bar, or the economic transition scenario, versus what is necessary for a net zero trajectory by 2050. And in fact, when we calculate the difference, we see a 1.3 gigaton CO2e difference over these next 8 years. The grid is also facing what some might describe as a crisis, or at least multiple interconnected challenges that could threaten reliability as well as these decarbonization efforts. And there's many different factors here, but I want to focus on 3 of them in particular. The first is load growth. Load growth in the United States has been essentially zero, or growing at 0% over the last, say, 20 years. And that's really become how people have thought about the US electric grid in terms of future growth for a long time. But we're seeing a significant shift in the understanding of what might happen here. Of course, first and foremost, people are thinking about electric vehicles and have been for several years. But now we have the added complexity of industrial electrification, the electrification of home heating systems. RMI did an analysis with it for the Houston metro area that suggested a potential minimum of 3.5% load growth through 2050 as a result of those activities. And that didn't take into account the potential for future additional load growth based on data center needs to power the ongoing AI revolution, or the potential further onshoring of manufacturing that is being enabled by the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. Second, the US is frankly just really bad at developing large transmission systems. And we have faced an ongoing lag in the development and rollout of new transmission lines. Many of you may be familiar with the 2015 example or the Clean Line effort, which ran for several years, which had a great ambition and a lot of good economic sense behind it, and really utterly failed to ultimately take off the ground or succeed, simply because it is very challenging in this country to build out multi-state high voltage transmission systems. And these systems will be necessary based on all the climate modeling that we have seen to achieve net zero at reasonable pace and reasonable cost. And then there is the generation stock replacement that is currently underway. The good news here is that coal plants have been retired or are being set to retire in the relatively near future. However, given these other complexities we are seeing in the market and for the grid, many RTOs and utilities are really scrambling to understand how they are going to get all of the megawatt hours that they will need if this load growth progresses as some are expecting it might. And of course, it would be the default is if we can't interconnect enough solar or wind generation over the next 10 years or so, they are going to turn to either keeping these coal plants running or building out large new natural gas facilities, which are also not aligned with a net zero future. So the point I want to make here is that we think companies have been showing a huge impact over the last decade through their renewable procurement, and also renewable procurement in isolation seems insufficient to address all of these challenges that we are going to be collectively facing. So ZEROgrid's goal is really to unlock the full potential for companies to address these dual challenges of reliability and decarbonization by addressing what we see as three key obstacles that are currently impeding progress. The first of these is a lack of consensus. And ZEROgrid, we want to create forums to enable these large companies, external experts, and other stakeholders to engage with each other in collaborative discussions and find areas of alignment and agreement. There are two key areas that we're tackling first and trying to build more consensus around are first, simply what should companies be doing beyond renewables procurement? Should they be adjusting how they procure? Are there adjustments to operations that they should be considering, or changes to where they invest money or engage with policymakers? There are a lot of avenues, but it's unclear which of these are going to be most fruitful in which parts of the country. The second piece is understanding if companies actually do take these actions, what are going to be the impacts? And understanding that in terms of both a reliability and a decarbonization lens can better inform where companies may want to invest their time and resources. The second barrier that we're seeing is a lack of clear guidance in terms of how to actually go about doing or undertaking these activities once you've determined what to do. SEBA has been a great example of the power of building capacity and enabling corporate action on the renewables front. And we similarly, in partnership with them, want to start to create the materials and resources and implementation guidance to allow companies to act quickly once they've determined the actions that are most important for them to pursue. And third is there's a lack of recognition for these types of activities. We know that companies want to be doing the right thing, but you also want to be recognized for taking these actions and going above and beyond what's expected or what your peers are doing. And as such, we think it's really important for ZEROgrid to engage both with the existing accounting policymakers or entities to ensure that these types of actions are being integrated and accounted for in those systems, or where necessary, stand up new recognition systems, particularly around, say, qualitative impacts that companies might be having in these different fields. Now, RMI certainly could not be undertaking all of this important work by ourselves, so we are really thrilled to be convening a variety of key stakeholders to collaborate on this shared mission. I want to focus first on the two advisory initiatives, which I already talked about a little bit on the last slide. First, the Reliability Advisory Initiative is where we are bringing together RTOs as well as corporate voices and others, to understand fundamentally what does the grid need in different parts of the country. And we're really excited to have entities like PJM, MISO, and New York ISO engaging in those conversations. The second one is the Impact Advisory Initiative, where we are bringing together leading academic thinkers, government organizations, and niche specialty companies that have really focused on these accounting issues to understand the state of the art and build alignment around how to measure the impact of these different actions. We are similarly thrilled to have 6 founding members who are lending their voices to the ZEROgrid effort. And RMI is acting as an organizer and facilitator for these conversations and will be leading the development of resources that try to synthesize the insights created by all of these parties. So with that context, I want to turn things back over to Erin and a couple of other folks on the line. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Steve. Appreciate that. So we just heard kind of an overview of what ZEROgrid is and why we are launching. We want to dig into a real discussion for what this means for companies. And to do that, I want to bring on Megan Lorenzen, the Director of Climate and Energy at Salesforce, and Rob Threlkeld, Director for Global Energy Strategy at General Motors, and keep Steve on the line here and dig into a little bit more detail about ZEROgrid and what we're trying to do. So thank you both so much for joining today. Really thrilled to have your wisdom and insights kind of shared with the group on the call. I want to get started with a broad question. You know, Steve just went over what is ZEROgrid and what are we looking to do. I would love to hear in your words why companies in particular should be thinking more about grid decarbonization and reliability and the impact that you're having on it. And why is this relevant? And Rob, maybe we can get started with you.
Yeah, and I think Steve articulated one of those. Obviously, from a GM perspective, we are creating some of those challenges, but opportunities when you think about electrification of the transportation sector. But, you know, as I looked at our manufacturing footprint as well, you know, manufacturing of electric vehicles actually is pretty energy intensive too, when you're thinking about the processes that go into building in the cells all the way to the vehicles itself. And so affordability and reliability are of utmost criticality when you look at it from a manufacturing perspective, but it also looking at it as we start to relate to our customers. And we want to make sure that we're moving down the path of an affordable, reliable grid that ultimately has an intersection point to our customers that we traditionally did not have in the past. So it's kind of a critical element as we look at it as the bellwether of manufacturing, but in the lens of customers or even our own employees, you know, as we think about the impacts of EVs as a whole, and ultimately how it impacts our goals as a company. When we do have our RE100 goal, as the SIBA chart was showing, we were one of the founding members within the SIBA organization as well, but it's a critical component to continue to scale as we decarbonize and engage in other aspects of the grid. And I think one of the aha moments that I had a couple of years back was when I was presenting out the board of directors of MISO, and they kind of commented, we'd love to have more of this corporate engagement because the only ones we really see in the room are the utilities.
Yeah. That's really helpful. Thanks for that, Rob. And Megan, would love to hear in your view, kind of obviously operating in a different industry than GM. Why is this relevant for Salesforce?
Yeah, and similar to where Rob started, this is critical to the success of our business. We're a cloud company, and so we run on the grid. We rely heavily on a reliable, stable, affordable grid. And back in 2013, we were one of many companies, I'm sure there are many folks on the line in similar places, who committed to 100% renewable energy as a way to accelerate this transition to a clean and renewable electricity grid. And we've hit that target. We have 100% renewable energy, which we define as purchasing renewable energy or equivalent certificates to match our global electricity use. And that's great, but that is just the start of the journey. It's really not the end, because our ultimate goal is power sector decarbonization. We want a future with a grid that's operating on clean and renewable resources, that's reliable, it's affordable, and purchasing renewable energy is a great tool in our toolbox, but you can, and we've seen many companies now have hit that target, and the grid remains dirty. And so I think what's particularly exciting about what ZEROgrid is doing and this new frontier is that you're helping unlock all the different levers that a company has to bring to the table. It's not just about purchasing renewable energy. There's so much more that we can do to help advance power sector decarbonization, and really thinking about that system-wide impact rather than, you know, the success or failure of an enterprise-centric target. I think that is really moving the needle and has the opportunity to really make waves in this space.
That's really helpful, Megan. Thank you so much. And Salesforce is obviously a company that has quite aggressive climate targets. Can you speak to kind of some of the challenges or areas of struggle that you see in the space right now that hinder Salesforce from being able to sort of unilaterally kind of achieve some of the goals that you just laid out in this space?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Steve, actually, the slide you started with lays it out really well. We as an industry have very clearly mastered the art of procuring renewable energy, and it has had enormous, exciting impact. But what we aren't seeing is the corresponding decarbonization of the grid. So I think we're at this really interesting inflection point where there's clearly appetite and passion and intent from all these companies who understand the critical work that is ahead of us. And we're trying to understand both what are those new efforts and levers we have to pull to drive the impact we're trying to see on the grid. So very excited about the work RMI is doing, convening so many different experts in the space to determine what are those actions we should be taking. And then on the flip side, Steve, you also mentioned this on the intro, we have been very narrowly incentivized to only take a few types of actions, namely purchasing renewable energy. And it really doesn't represent the full scope of what companies can and should be doing to advance a decarbonized grid. And so really exciting to think about, both what should we be doing and how can we incentivize that action for companies. Right now, our hands are really truly tied. And I think, there are opportunities like how do you use your business and your product to advance decarbonization? And Rob, I imagine you have a whole list of examples in this space on how a company like GM and the way in which you are building your business case can help advance power sector decarbonization. And we're trying to think about that with our technology and how we can help enable disclosures and insights. And so really it's just one example of the many different tools companies can bring to the table, but we're not currently being asked or incentivized to.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And Rob, I want to hear some of your ideas on the opportunities piece as well. But Megan, could you just speak really briefly to kind of what you mean precisely by incentives? Because that is so core to what we're trying to do. And I think so core to what we've heard from the community of companies we've brought together is sort of missing in the landscape now of, we've got the incentives for operational and supply chain targets now. Where is that system level incentive for companies? Could you just speak a little bit more to that?
Oh gosh, it's such a complicated issue right now. There are so many, I think, intersecting facets to it, for lack of a better term. You have what was a voluntary space increasingly moving to a regulated space. You have a lot of scrutiny on the claims companies are making to try to ensure protection for consumers, prevent greenwashing. And so there's a lot of fear now all of a sudden for companies who are wanting to take action to make sure we're taking the right type of action, we're articulating it correctly. And so there's this really important balance of making sure we are protecting consumers, being clear about what we're doing so no one's being misled, but also incentivizing and rewarding companies and being able to clearly and transparently identify which companies are leading and which ones aren't. So there's a lot happening in this space. And I think it may sound silly, but oftentimes it's the tail that wags the dog, what we're able to talk about, what we're able to disclose on our emissions footprints. Those all help prioritize or incentivize different types of action.
Thank you so much for that, Megan. And Rob, would love to hear your reflections on that as well, on the incentives piece and how GM thinks about kind of right sizing those for these system level impacts, along with kind of the current challenges to doing so.
Yeah, no, and I think Megan articulated a lot of great things on that component as well. And when you really start to think about system level solutions and the what SEBA has actually really done to scale up corporate procurement of renewables, but as we start to think system, most of the regulatory context was around regulating utilities or regulating the transportation sector. And now that we're actually interlinked together, how do we start to think about system level solutions that bridge both of those impacts together in ways that allow companies to both receive the benefit, but also to be able to receive the recognition as it relates to the work that we're doing in this space. I also want to bring up one of the great work streams that we're doing with RMI as well as the virtual power plant partnership. So how do we leverage all the tools in the toolbox that are really out there for us to be able to continue to accelerate grid decarbonization. And, the virtual power plant partnership really is about how do we take all these demand response resources, whether it's EVs, battery storage, thermostats, how do you leverage those in a way that can scale up and aggregate and then be able to participate in the markets that we both have our manufacturing footprint, but where our customers are as well? How do we enable our customers, to be able to get access to that market? As a homeowner, you might not realize, or you may not even understand how, that EV could become an asset of the future. Or, hey, maybe I subscribe to some of the programs with my smart thermostats and utility kind of manages the process, but we don't really see the broader benefits. So how do companies engaging in these areas like the virtual power plant partnership also be able to receive the recognition of the work we're doing and access the market and enable really the broad benefit to the customer base at that point, which is all of us that are participating in this space, whether it's a heavy manufacturer or whether it's the residential customer, in this broad transition. And then having those conversations, as we've kind of participated at the various different groups that we're engaged with, whether it's the RTOs or the utilities or the regulators. I know we've been highly engaged in the state of Michigan right now because of all the issues around grid reliability in the state of Michigan. We've had a number of large scale outages. In fact, we have one of the worst reliable grids, in the country within Michigan. And so we see it firsthand and we're fully engaged into it to address that, going forward into the future. So I think one, it's incentivizing companies to want to participate, providing the companies with ammunition to be able to actually go out and articulate both what their companies are already doing, because some of them may not necessarily recognize the opportunities that they have, as well as how they can then engage into the various work streams, whether it's with the RTOs or whether it's with the utilities or the policymakers, to be able to continue to scale up not only our only renewable energy procurement efforts, but our efforts around engagement of the broad customer base that we support.
That's great. Thank you so much for that, Rob. And we just got a question in the chat that I want to go ahead and ask because it's very relevant to how GM thinks about how the ZEROgrid works and the VP3 work, for that matter, fits into your overall target setting process, which I think is kind of a lens through which a lot of companies on the call will probably be thinking through, like, okay, what does this actually mean for my work? In terms of how you're participating right now in ZEROgrid, do you see it, how does the kind of resiliency piece fit alongside your scope 3 reductions targets? And how do you think about how each of those kind of tracks feeds into your overall strategy?
Well, the broad strategies ultimately get to 0, 0, 0. So 0 crashes, 0 emissions, and 0 congestion. So we sit right into that 0 emissions category. And as I look at our scope 1, 2, and 3, our scope 1 and 2 are like 2% of our broad emission, of our emissions, even though we're one of the largest purchasers of renewables, 1.7 gigawatts of renewables that we've procured, primarily within the United States. And we've got some significant work going outside of the United States. But as we look at that, it's still a small part of it. So as we move down the path of transportation and engage our supply chain, because we have a number of suppliers reach out to us saying, hey, we want to support this, but we have certain challenges that are in place. Where else can we engage? One, you can engage in ZGI or VP3, some of those other external efforts to help continue to broad decarbonization of the grid. So just lending their voice with the massive amount of the supply chain base that we have is huge, and can really start to articulate the efforts to get the grid to 0 emissions. And it would be great, if we go in front of legislators, policymakers, regulators, to have 200 of our suppliers, with us in the room at the same time. Would be a very loud voice to say, we're not only creating jobs in this space as we go down the path of electrification, but we're critically, working with within their own companies to set their goals, but supporting broad companies like General Motors and their goals around scope 3. And then the other aspect of that is around the transportation sector. How do we leverage the EV as an asset to continue to reduce, carbon emissions and or the reliability aspect? And I think it depends on the different customer too, which is an interesting aspect that we look at when you think about EVs. Some are going to look at it from an affordability. Some are going to look at it as a reliability and resiliency play because they can power their home from, in the event that there is a power outage. And then there's others that are going to be really astute to looking at how can I leverage this as a tool to continue to decarbonize the grid. And so I think it gives us the lens to be able to meet a broad base of customers and the value that EVs ultimately can bring, that then drives back towards our goal of 0 emissions. So when you think about that, it's kind of the broad vision of 0 emissions, what we're doing at the manufacturing side, what we're doing at the supply chain side, and what we're doing on the vehicle side. Both VP3 and ZEROgrid play a critical element of really leveraging the scale of GM and ultimately leveraging the scale of the industry at a voice at the table that we traditionally didn't have in the past.
Yeah, thank you for that, Rob. And Megan, I want to hear from you on that question too. But first, Rob, you also kind of raised how you think about the different levers of influence that GM has in this space. And Steve, I want to go over to you and just see, I would love to hear you reflect on kind of how ZEROgrid is thinking about the different levers that companies can use to influence those systems-based reliability and grid decarbonization mechanisms. So could you speak a little bit to that?
Sure. I think we're thinking about this as 4 or 5, depending on how you count them, buckets of activities that might fall under what we're going to be studying and releasing resources about. The first is procurement, but thinking about not just how do you procure renewables, but are there different ways that you should be thinking about doing it, and how do you buy it? How do you measure its impact overall? The second is operations, thinking about prioritizing operational innovations that reduce footprint or support the grid of the future. So this could, say, impact where facilities might be built if locating in one grid region as opposed to another is better aligned with what's needed. The third is, and here's a couple of subcategories here, is investment. And this is both first choosing which external projects or technologies to invest resources in terms of we want to buy this new thing or really stand up this new technology as part of our operations, or understanding where companies may want to make tactical investments by either providing direct sponsorships to academic institutions or internally spending R&D dollars on developing new technologies that are going to support this transition further. And then last but not least is policy, thinking about coordinating and prioritizing the regulatory policy and standard efforts to accelerate reliable grid decarbonization.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Steve. And thank you to everyone for putting questions in the chat. These are incredibly useful to see, and we're going to try to address all of them. Megan, I'd love to go over to you to hear kind of one, how this fits into your overall strategy. And then I'd love to get down to brass tacks, so kind of how ZEROgrid's work fits into the overall sustainability strategy you have, and maybe an example of a project that you're hoping to unlock through ZEROgrid, or some kind of very specific examples of work that you guys are looking to get off the ground over the next year that ZEROgrid can maybe help accelerate.
Yeah, definitely. And just to address the question, I think Rob put it really well, that this is not just limited to scope 3. We are committed to the global goal of net zero, which means that as an individual company, we need to see our emissions reduced by half by 2030 and near zero by mid-century. And that is about our supply chain. Scope 3 is a huge part of our emissions, as I'm sure it is for many folks on the line. And that's all underpinned by the electricity sector. And so the progress we can drive here is going to have a trickle-down effect to all of our respective emissions. So we see it as deeply embedded. This is, there's a direct impact on our scope 2, but there's this even bigger indirect impact on our scope 3, and is really critical to a successful pathway to net zero. So wanted to first start there. In terms of how we see this work really enabling our own sustainability strategy, we have always talked about the way in which a company can act is thinking about what a company makes and how we can leverage your products or services to advance this clean energy transition. We think about how we operate and how we make those products. So our supply chain, how we engage our supply chain, how we might shift the way in which we operate, be it demand side management or otherwise, how we use our capital. So Steve, you mentioned it's not just purchasing renewable energy, but it's also investing in other uses of your capital, your tax appetite, et cetera. And then our influence, so what we say and ask of others, whether it's a lawmaker or building out ecosystem activation with efforts like ZEROgrid. So really, I think just those 5 pillars of ZEROgrid are really tightly related to how we think about the levers a company can bring to the table. And so then when we think about our strategy, what I am particularly excited about is how ZEROgrid can help us think more creatively and push us to do more and different things in those different categories of action. Now, we've been really active in the policy space. We added climate to the company's public policy platform back in 2021, alongside core issues like privacy and security. And so that was a huge step forward, getting company-wide mandate to advocate for science-based climate policies to really accelerate that just and equitable transition to 1.5. So really excited to do more there. That enabled us to be a leading voice on support for the climate provisions of IRA, which I think we can all agree is really helping unlock this space. And so what more can we be doing on policy is, the next topic, permitting, transmission, et cetera. I think on the investment side, so I'm intentionally not talking about renewable procurement. I think we've all been there. But on the investment side, there are other types of capital we can deploy. We have this amazing team within our Salesforce Ventures, which is our venture capital arm of Salesforce. And it's our impact fund, which specifically focuses on investing in portfolio companies that are aligned to some of our core values like climate. And so they have done, I think it's somewhere in the order of 10 really innovative investments in climate companies that are working on issues like grid decarbonization and accelerating the energy transition. And so it's been fascinating to see how we can pull in other teams to advance this shared objective.
Thank you so much for that, Megan. And I just want to note, everyone sending in questions from the audience, thank you so much. I'm going to move over to those very shortly and just run through them. But Rob, I want to give you a chance to talk through any kind of specific case studies that you'd like to share with the group on projects that GM has either done or would like to do that kind of lean into the type of work that kind of systems level grid decarbonization and reliability piece that we've been speaking about.
I think Megan kind of articulated a couple of those too. I mean, we've got the climate fund. Obviously, we've invested in a number of areas that drive equity into the equation as well. But then we've also got the GM Ventures side that is investing in various different battery technologies that could, look at from a different, whether it's vehicle, transportation, electrification batteries, or the solid state batteries that potentially could go into different large scale battery storage solutions as well, to our investments in, wind catching systems and looking at how do you continue to accelerate decarbonization through offshore wind and some of the other means that can actually continue to get close to the population bases when you think about what offshore wind can potentially do. Obviously, that is still an area of growth in the world as we go from an offshore wind, but how do companies look at it from a reward perspective as we engage in various technologies that could have a transformative impact on the industry from a decarbonization perspective? And then how do we engage those conversations from a technology point to the RTOs and to the utilities to lend some comfort into that? Utilities are ultimately very conservative. How do we start to drive some of that conservatism out into the areas of electrification as a whole, and how that potentially can impact them and where they can play a big part in it as well? Because obviously most of our facilities are going to be in states that are regulated, and that's probably where it's going to ultimately take place. And so how do we then think about our voice in ways that can efficiently deploy capital? And when I say efficiently deploy capital, it isn't necessarily General Motors capital, it's the utilities capital, it's third parties capital, as we think about the investments that are going to be needed in this space to ultimately address low growth, and then figure out where those tools fit into. As I mentioned earlier, the EVs can be a portion of that when you think about virtual power plant partnerships and aggregating up EVs and accessing the market. So I think those are some of the ways we're really going to, I know I mentioned multiple ones, but things that we're thinking about. How do we then look at each one of those as part of the solution? And then how do we engage in the right areas with our supply chain or our engagements with the policymakers and regulators as well?
That's great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. I want to move over to some of our audience questions. And I know we had one question that looks like Steve is typing an answer in the chat too, around why have we only engaged 3 RTOs as part of the advisory initiative? Steve, I wonder, as kind of a voiceover into the broader ecosystem strategy that we're doing, it might be worth just touching on, the wider system that we're engaging and where we look to sit as a kind of very aligned player with existing efforts and existing kind of RTOs. So would you want to just speak to that a little bit verbally as well?
Sure. So on the RTO front, I want to be clear, we're not trying to be exclusive here, and we are reaching out and interested in having conversations with all of the RTOs, and we have been engaging several of them that are not listed on that slide. The ones listed there have simply been the ones who have raised their hands and decided to become more engaged at this point.
That's great. Thanks so much, Steve. And there's a question in here around saying that, a critical outcome of ZGI, by the way, stands for Zero Grid, for those on the call who keep wondering why we keep saying those initials. So Zero Grid Initiative, we've sometimes called ZGI, that there's an effort to kind of claim a new corporate credit of some kind for grid decarbonization impacts. And I wonder, Steve, if you could speak a little bit to kind of our theory of change there for how we want to kind of recognize and incentivize the work that corporates are doing as part of Zero Grid.
Yes, and I started to talk about this earlier, but happy to expand. So as many of you know, the greenhouse gas protocol is really one of the central underpinning sort of policies or mechanisms through which corporate action is recognized today, that is going through a relatively unusual or rare refresh process right now. So we do see this, this feels like a very timely initiative in that if we have the ability to help influence that type of guidance, to embed guidance and insights around how to measure and quantify the impacts of some of these other types of actions that we are talking about, that could be a really powerful lever to further incentivize companies to take these actions that we know are helpful. We also recognize separately that there may be other types of actions that are very difficult or simply impossible to quantify ultimately. Things like engaging policymakers may or may not ultimately result in changes, but are the types of activities that we may want to ultimately sort of highlight or showcase in some form. So we are exploring mechanisms to provide that qualitative recognition as well.
That's great. Thank you so much. And yes, those should start being live on our website later next month. We're almost at October already. So we will have an updated version of our website going live around Verge. If any of you on the call will be at Verge, we do have a ZEROgrid panel on the 24th at 3:30. So we'd love to see you in person there and have a conversation about it. Let us know if you'll be there. We'd love to meet in person. But just a couple of other questions. I know we're getting toward needing to kind of talk through next steps and how folks on the call can participate. But I wonder, Steve, if you could speak very briefly to the 24. We've got a question about 24/7 versus emissions first. For those on the call that are kind of living in the scope 2 space, I'm sure you're very familiar with this. Could you speak to kind of, this person is asked, are both critical right now, or is there one that's more critical in the short term? What I like about this question is acknowledges that kind of both could have a space moving forward, but could you speak a little bit to that?
Yes, and this is both a very active space of conversation and one where I think we view a need for further consensus. So it is exactly this type of conversation that we think ZEROgrid could help inform. And in fact, we have participants in the Impact Advisory Initiative who bring differing perspectives on exactly this type of question. I think RMI, I would hesitate to speak for all of RMI on this topic, but I think maybe broadly, we see value in both approaches and are really hoping to leverage the ZEROgrid platform as a way to build more consensus about this type of question, about what's necessary right now, what do we want to set ourselves up for in the future, et cetera.
That's great. Thank you so much, Steve. I want to move into how people can get involved, but Megan and Rob, I want to close with just one quick question for both of you, which is I'd love to just hear kind of for folks on the call, what is one specific topic or area that you're really energized to lean in and explore with some of the companies on the call over the next year? If you could just share that briefly.
All right, I'm happy to jump in first. I would say, and this ties a little bit back to the incentive question that Steve, you answered a minute or two ago. To date, we have been so focused on enterprise level change. And I think what is fascinating about ZEROgrid is this opportunity to pick your head up and think about the system level impact. So if we think about all of the options a company has in front of them to drive change, generally speaking, we're measuring them on a marginal abatement cost curve based on impact and cost to our own business. But what if we had the opportunity to instead say, what is the marginal abatement cost curve for system-wide decarbonization? And then how can I, as a company that has a different set of skills than a company like GM and what Rob can bring to the table, where and what should I do to advance the system change? And so I think for me, I'm very fascinated to be part of this conversation that I think pulls us away from the traditional lanes and constraints we've had around having a very specific commodity that we can match up against this part of our emissions footprint, to say, if we are just trying to drive change and we all agree that for our businesses, we need a reliably decarbonized grid and we need a just energy transition, what are those actions we should be taking and how can we make sure we are able to take those actions and are incentivized to do so and not penalized, and really just thinking of beyond our own four walls. So I think for me, that's what I'm most excited about, and that might translate into a lot of different types of investments, but excited to learn more and really shake up what we've been doing to date.
Thank you so much, Megan. Rob, would love to hear the same from you.
Yeah, and from my end, it's really to tap into the enormous automotive supply chain. I mean, given the amount of parts that go into a vehicle, and we've got obviously some of the largest companies in the world that are automotive suppliers when you think tier one, but when you get down to the mom and pops, and I've heard from a number of the suppliers that setting RE100 goals is a little bit of a challenge, but we are trying to work through and setting, climate related targets. And I think this is a real strong opportunity for them to participate, lend a voice, and really, be impactful as it relates to what they may want to set from a goals perspective, but how it ties right into the work that we're doing from a GM perspective as well, and ultimately what the organization can do as a whole. So that's the part that I'm really excited about doing, because I think it's a hugely untapped resource, and that has tens of thousands of suppliers that can really start to leverage and make a change. And they're potentially producing the products that are going to go into our products that can produce the change as well. And being able to tie that back to them saying, you're a key element for us to ultimately electrify our business, which is going to allow us to electrify and decarbonize the grid. And how you play a part in that will be an integral element for getting to zero emissions.
Thank you so much, Rob. And I want to thank you both so much for joining today and sharing your insights and wisdom. This has been fantastic. Really, really, really appreciate that. Before we close, I do want to jump into, for those on the call, how you can get involved and join over the next year and answer one of the final questions. If you've asked a question and haven't heard it answered, please do go look at the answered Q&A box. We have written down answers to some of the questions that we couldn't get to in the conversation. Thank you so much for all of the great questions that we got. We clearly have a very informed audience here today. So what does it mean to actually join ZEROgrid was one of the questions. And what are you actually going to do? That is a very valid question. So a couple of things that I want to frame up. Over the next few months, we have 4 key ways that we are hoping to support companies looking to advance their work in grid decarbonization and reliability. One, we're going to be publishing a grid decarbonization roadmap and toolkit for companies that is really the kind of central capacity building element that we hope can support starting a broader conversation about what it means to move beyond kind of operational and supply chain work in the renewable space toward actually having measurable grid impacts through those efforts. So we will be publishing the first version of that toolkit within the next month or two. It will be on our website. We will be doing some trainings and webinars around it. So if you're interested in that, stay tuned. We will be sharing that information once it's available. That will be a live document that we hope to build out over time that can be a very practical tool for companies. And that will be open source. So you do not have to be involved with us in any way to be able to take advantage of that. Secondly, we have our reliability and impact advisory initiatives. That is the direct engagement with standard setters, with Resurity, Watt Time, and with the RTOs that you saw in Steve's slide that he shared. Those direct channels to define, okay, what can we actually measure right now? And what are the gaps? And how do we create the right incentives to address those gaps? And then on the reliability side, how can RTOs and companies work more closely together to build substantial pathways toward grid decarbonization and reliability? And then lastly, we have practical projects that we want to help serve as a matchmaker for, help accelerate, kind of incubate within the work of ZEROgrid and see launch in the real world. So those are kind of our initial activities that we're looking to see over the next few years. We hope that regardless of what type of company you are or where you sit in the space, you can either engage in the informal capacity building opportunities that we have, or through formal collaboration and partnership. We will have that formal collaborator kind of status. Salesforce and General Motors are 2 of our working group collaborators. You can see the benefits on the right-hand slide here. I won't run through them very clearly, but that's where that kind of more direct engagement comes from. We do want to grow that group really intentionally. We want to have, we want to be able to still have those kind of deep one-on-one conversations that we've been able to have these past few months as we launched, and enable each new collaborator to have those as well. So if you're interested in that, get in touch with us. You can email me or just email info@zerogrid.org. We'd love to have a one-on-one conversation with you regardless if you're interested in learning more. If you go to the next slide, before we close, I just want to quickly kind of run through our timeline this year. We just launched in July. We are still a new baby initiative. If you join as a collaborator this year, you will be helping define our priorities for year 1. We just had a Climate Week reception. We were also so thrilled to have a Climate Week banner in Times Square that NASDAQ helped get us. So ZEROgrid was very visible and out front at Climate Week. We will be at Verge next month, as I mentioned, on October 24th. We really hope to see you there. And then we'll be launching our formal programming in November and December of this year after that Verge panel. That's when our playbook will go live. So we hope that you will be on this journey with us, either formally or informally. We think this work is absolutely critical. And we think it's absolutely critical that we have as wide a group of companies paying attention to this and activating around it. So thank you for joining today and being part of this session. We really look forward to talking with you, hopefully seeing you next month and beyond in future conversations. And in the meantime, I hope you have a great week. And I just want to thank again our panelists, Rob and Megan and Steve. Thank you so much for your time today as well. Hope you all have a great week.